Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Fusion Strike, make sure you go ahead and check out the Poketown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be going over our Brilliant Stars tier list. We have been testing for almost a month now already. Knowing that we have IRL events coming back, it's really brought our attention and our focus towards playing this format. And yeah, there's still a ton of archetypes out there that we still need to discuss and look over and playtest a little bit more, because this set brings us Arceus, which already gives us potentially 20 archetypes. So we'll be talking about a few of the highlight Arceus decks that we've already looked at and some of the other brand new archetypes, as well as talking about how the new decks will be shaping, or sorry, the current decks will be shaping up with little tweaks to the meta based on their new additions. So do you want to kick us off with one of these archetypes, Jack?
Yeah, and we'll start with Arceus. I think Dark Arceus so far has been our favourite Arceus build, and we're going to stick it straight in Tier 1. Arceus is an incredibly flexible card that Joe has just sort of alluded to. So pairing that with a partner that can naturally deal with the best deck in the format right now, which is Mew, and spoiler alert, it still looks to be really good with this new set. If anything, even better maybe. So having a good partner to be able to deal with that is going to be really important. So naturally, Dark type Pokemon are going to be a natural fit for this kind of archetype. And so far, it's been really good. There's been a couple of limiting factors, damage limitations here and there into matchups where you're not hitting for weakness can sometimes be an issue. But in general, it's been the most consistent Arceus build. It's been the most flexible Arceus build in terms of being able to still play a couple of other things. We're also playing sort of a mini fighting package as well for other Arceus sort of mirror matches, but you could easily sub that out for another type. It's not quite like a counter box style Arceus that we'll get to in a moment, but this is more focused on trying to basically bully Mew. But in general, it's been really good, and it's looks to be, I think, one of the better Arceus builds. I think a lot of the Arceus builds are definitely at least tier 2, because Arceus's V-Star power, letting you pick up any 2 cards at one point during the game, means that you can kind of always get into the game with these kind of decks. But I think this is the best one in terms of tier list, because, like I say, it's intent on bullying Mew, which is really what you want to be doing in the first, I think, for these first IRL tournaments coming back.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And you can do some cool stuff. The Moltres is just such a better card this format. You get the Choice Belt to make it just a generically good attacker anyway. And you have the E-Switch shenanigan plays that you can make with Arceus for random turn 1 high rolls where you can hit 130 into 1 prizes, which is really good for a race in some matchups. So yeah, there's a lot going for it, not just a type coverage beatdown. Pretty good. Let's talk about another Arceus deck, I think, because we just have so many to clear off of the line here. Let's go for Ice Rider Arceus. Now, we've done a gauntlet of this on the channel already, so you can see where our sort of main thoughts were with that deck. And even at the end of that video, I think we chat for about 15 minutes or so, just talking about the list itself and what we would think about changing and whatnot. But it feels kind of strange. It's caught between being that tempo deck, but having the damage power spikes of the Choice Belt Leon plays that everyone's excited by, that you can reach that 310 threshold. 310 can be pretty good. If Mew's choosing to play Oricorio, it's not actually that good, and other VMAXs don't care that much, but the 280 is actually the number that I think Ice Rider achieves very easily and is good into other Arceus matchups, so we think that'll be relevant. And just as a quick spoiler, I think most of the decks that are involving Arceus, we're going to rate tier 2 at kind of the lowest end, because going first with Arceus decks is really good. You just guarantee very good turn 2s as long as you can Starbirth. And we were trying out not only Arceus and Ice Rider, we were also trying Inteleon lines. It's like a thin package in there, which gives you really good outs to hit that Starbirth turn 2, even if you're not necessarily playing a thick line of Arceus. And that allows you to either attack with Arceus turn 2 and spread energies around, which means you're not tied towards the Melony every turn game plan that Ice Rider can sometimes fall prey to. And it also opens up, a chunky 2-prizer. There's a lot of meat to get through here. When you're throwing, a couple Arceus and an Ice Rider, or one Arceus and a couple Ice Riders at the opponent. Yes, of course, they can gust around, and Inteleon's a thing there, but it just is a lot to get through for the most part. We've tried it with no Intel engine, and we've tried it with like just bats and minions. And I think I personally land on it being best with Inteleon still, because you don't really take advantage of there being like Luminion and Crobat because you don't have much turn 1 tempo anyway. You're really a turn 2 aggressive deck. So I think it sits fairly well in tier 2, can hit some decent numbers, but it seemed more like flashy than it needs to be. But it can be good into a lot of Arceus matchups. You are representing a 3-prizer rather than a Zapdos, but you have, you're not weak to Path to the Peak and stuff like that. And obviously the Ice Rider is much chunkier than Zapdos, so you're not just doing a 2-for-2 trade and accelerating a race, which is no good if you're already behind in a mirror. So yeah, an interesting archetype. I think a lot of people are excited by Ice Rider. We've kind of been like whelmed, not really over or underwhelmed. It's just like, it's just doing its thing, but it's not like so much better than it's already been.
Yeah, the backbone of the deck is still a Melony deck, and it's kind of the same as Welder decks of old, where at the end of the day, it's not a good draw supporter. It's just some additional support you get whilst having the flashy effect of attaching energy. And sometimes when playing the deck, it did feel like, you needed your Starbirth to be able to play the game, or you needed your Inteleons to be able to play the game. Whereas, something like Dark Arceus can just play Marnies, play Researchers, that kind of thing, and just obviously draw so much more than a Melony style deck. So yeah, it definitely felt flashier. But yeah, like you say, whelmed is I think a very, very good phrase as to how we're feeling. More Arceus builds. Let's take a punt at the sort of counter box build that I mentioned when talking about Dark Arceus. We feel like this is right in between those 1 and 2 tiers in that 1.5. Essentially, it's trying to do something similar to Dark Arceus. It's trying to pick different types to target different sort of approaches, different decks in the meta, and just be a good counter with Arceus kind of tying it all together, because you can theoretically weave in the correct type using Starbirth and that energy acceleration. The reason why it's a little bit worse than Dark Arceus is because obviously I think naturally there will be a dark element to this, but it will be probably there'll be a bit less of a focus than the pure Dark Arceus build. So you're probably not going to have as convincing a Mew matchup, which I think is very relevant. Typically in this build, we've actually been playing Umbreon instead of Moltres, because you have a lot of other tempo attackers, so you don't need kind of the tempo from Moltres. So instead you're able to... that means you can use the Umbreon's ability to be able to boss something up and still be able to use a draw supporter here and there. So, but that naturally lends itself to 1 being a 3-prizer and 2 being an evolution, so it's a little bit slower. So you can actually see you're trading off some percentage points in the Mew matchup to be able to play maybe a Suicune package, or a couple of other types to hit the water decks or hit the fire decks or that kind of thing. Naturally, again, you're probably going to have a more even matchup spread across the board because you have something for everything, but that does also mean you're naturally a little bit less consistent, and that's why it's in between that sort of 1.5 and 2 tier. I still think there's definite potential for an Arceus box, maybe a little bit less built or a little bit less varied than the one we've built at the moment. There was 3 different types in the box, which could be like what could be pushed or holding it back from that tier 1 could just be you just need to pick 2 types and hope that you hit the right matchups on the day, kind of like the dark build does. I'm almost certain it's always going to be dark, and it's just whether you're running a water package or a fighting package or whatever. But yeah, this is trying to literally cram everything in, cram a lot of different energies in, and try and do it all. And so far, it's worked. It's been pretty successful. I think that's testament to Umbreon more than anything, because being able to have brilliant turns with Arceus without having to use and still being able to use a supporter and then use the Umbreon to boss something up as well means you can create incredibly powerful turns. Even like crazy stuff like being able to Marnie plus boss on turn 2, killing the main attacker and accelerating your board feels absolutely disgusting. But obviously that's like a very, very... that's not going to happen every game. So yeah, it feels very flashy. It feels flashier than sort of the pure dark build, and it feels like it can do more, but that might be what's holding it back from that tier 1. We just need to really hone in on the exact types we want. But yeah, like I say, I'm pretty sure we're always going to have dark type in there just because Mew exists. So it's just kind of maybe working out what that final type is, which is where we're kind of leaning in that tier 1 dark Arceus is sort of just dark with a very small fighting package.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just trying to spin too many plates sometimes just catches you whiffing the the right type at the right time. Let's take a look at Cawthorn's deck. I was really excited to start testing this deck in this new format. Previously, I kind of liked it as a Mew Smasher, but hated the fact that you would just insta-scoop some matchups outside of the Galarian Wheezing package that came in, just to try and like slow down other Inteleon engines and give yourself a window of opportunity against Jolteon. I think now you get to strip away the Wheezing package pretty comfortably and just play Manaphy. So immediately you gain some space, which is really nice, and also your matchup spread gets way safer just having Manaphy. The deck already plays a ton of Pokemon Recovery, which makes me pretty excited about it. The thing that sort of stunted my excitement a little bit was how awkward its matchup is into Arceus variants. I think you really do boast that good Mew matchup, which is keeping it relevant as a one prize archetype, and people can't really play around Galarian Moltres, the baby, very easily at all. You're going to be Puritan one prize. They eventually have to give you two decent power spikes of the Moltres, and sometimes that will just be enough to win games. But you are sort of twiddling your thumbs in that opening, and if the opponent, especially the Arceus player, is going to be picking off your intel package, which is so important to your setup, you're just not really going to get off the ground, and sometimes having to like three-shot their first Arceus is really difficult for you, and you can get wrecked at that point, especially if they are doing those gusting plays and just stifling a setup. So annoyingly, I think Arceus does sort of take the place of the spread decks as a bad matchup, and that's why we can't really have it pushing much higher. But in general, we're pretty excited by some one prize decks, and I think the Manaphy is a massive win for decks like this, and we definitely know that the Malevolent Charge Moltres is going into a few packages. Like, we've tried it with Arceus, we've tried it with a couple other decks that we'll talk about later on the list, and it's a very, very good card in this format, especially in this build where you can intel ping things a little bit easier into your range. And with that Wheezing sort of coming out of the list, you have space for a couple of Choice Belt as well to do some extra math fixing. So you, in some instances, are able to twiddle your thumbs for like 3 turns, knowing that you can sometimes turn it all around with 2 attacks. So that's a pretty nice thing to boast. But figuring out these Arceus matchups has been our challenge with the deck so far, so we're going to keep it in 1.5.
Yeah. Next up, let's take a look at Jolteon. Jolteon is kind of undisputed the second most popular deck right now, and I think in a lot of people's eyes, the second best deck right now. We actually think it drops all the way down to tier 2, and it's for a couple of interesting reasons. Firstly, obviously, Manaphy's existence naturally puts pressure on these kind of sniping archetypes. We have we have Rapid Strike Urshi, and we have Jolteon. I feel like, obviously, there's been a big disparity between those two recently, naturally because Mew has weakness on one and it doesn't have weakness on another, and also one of them is a path deck and one of them isn't, which obviously Mew doesn't like. So naturally, Jolteon has become a better counter or better placed in the meta than Urshifu over the past 3 months. That's kind of undisputed. But the one big thing about Urshifu is the fact that even though the sniping potential of Urshi is monstrous, it's one of the best, sort of most efficient snipes we've ever seen. It's not just a one-trick pony. It has a decent sort of V Pokemon. It has a decent first attack in Gale Thrust, a very, very good tempo attack. You don't have to commit basically anything to be able to just push 150 turn 2, which is really good. And in that respect, Jolteon is kind of a bit of a one-trick pony in some instances. So if Manaphy exists in such a capacity that these spread decks are hurt, the Jolteon deck is definitely going to be hurt, I think, more than the Urshifu deck. On top of that, there's also the natural progression of Zapdos coming back into the format. Jolteon doesn't really like, because even under Path, an Arceus player is very happy to see a Jolteon matchup in the first place anyway, because you have to 3-shot into them to get 2 prizes. But also, they're very happy to stack 4 energy on a Zapdos, because you can't one-shot a Zapdos. So that Zapdos is always going to be able to trade up into you. So obviously, Path being a thing, it can be a little bit awkward finding, bosses and this, that, and the other. But naturally, Path isn't as much of an issue for Zapdos as it once was because in the exact Arceus builds we're talking about, you can just accelerate a load of energy on there, knowing that you're not going to get one shot. So yes, you've accelerated 4 energy, but you're always taking 3 prizes, and at that point you're halfway through the game. So the natural entry of Zapdos back into the format is also another issue for Jolteon. But that being said, Path is still a huge part of this format. There have been games where like Arceus has lost because it got Path turn 1 by a Jolteon and could never use Starbirth, so could never get into the game. The more people lean into Starbirth, the more people will be leaning into getting countered by Path. So if they don't respect Path, it definitely can be an issue for Arceus players. I feel like in the large majority of games that Arceus gets into, it should be pretty favoured because the prize trade is just not good for Jolteon at all. But you can, in the same way that you can lock Mew out of games to Jolteon, dropping a Path on turn 1, you can lock Arceus out of games like that. And the push towards, more 2 prize engines with Crobats and Luminions and Eldergosses also means that people have to respect Path a lot more, and people that don't respect Path will be punished by Jolteon because all of those Pokemon are great for picking off with Jolteon later down the line. So yeah, Jolteon's in a really weird spot where it hates Manaphy, and it kind of one crutch all depends on how much Manaphy is played. Another crutch is how much sort of people respect Path and that kind of thing. And I think both of those things combined push Jolteon down to be nowadays worse than Urshi. Urshi, we'll talk about Urshi in a little bit, but obviously it gains decent typing into a lot of the Arceus builds, which is good. Obviously, Mew is still a bit of an issue, but naturally with Ultra Ball and Choice Belt, that kind of thing, it's never been better to try and add Moltres into decks. We've already mentioned it in the first 10 minutes of this video, and it's the exact same with Urshi. You can shove a Moltres package in, and all of a sudden, a lot of those headaches don't go away, but are a lot more manageable. So all of these kind of things combining, even Urshifu existing more so, kind of pushes Jolteon down the tier list as well. So Jolteon's a real... It's weird. It doesn't actually gain anything or lose anything in terms of sort of deck lists or anything like that. It doesn't even want to play Ultra Balls that much. It's it's pretty happy with its ball search cards. It's almost unchanged, but the meta around it has just formed in such a way that it's really being pushed down, I think. And it's a shame because obviously this was, I think, a lot of people's go-to deck because they didn't want to play the Bidoof, or they don't want to play Mew. They wanted to counter Mew. There will be ways to do that, but I don't think Jolteon's the way to do that anymore.
Yeah, really interesting how that's developed. And I'll actually touch on Dragapult now. That's really been a forgotten concept in this current format. But if we are seeing people get creative with, once again, the Drizzle engine and the maybe even the Cincino engine, again, with the new Mincino coming out, and just other one-prize decks coming out to play again. I know there's a lot of excitement about Mad Party. There's some excitement around Rapid Strike Malamar. Even in our testing group, we're pretty excited about that deck. And obviously Dragapult laughs his way around Manaphy, doesn't matter at all. So as a potential spread deck, we really like Dragapult's potential here. And it also gains that choice belt to really improve those terrible numbers that it is hitting right now in the format. Now with Belt and Horrors, you can get kind of close to where you want to be, which is kind of nice. And like Jack said with Jolteon, there could be a lot more like Luminion and Crobat around, and Dragapult is very good at sort of spreading onto those guys over a number of turns, especially with Inteleon pings and taking freebies here and there, which is very, very strong. So it's actually very different as a contrast to why we are putting it in the same tier as Jolteon. It's not the fact that it's a good spreading mon, it's actually probably the best or the safest spreading mon right now, and can't just be walled out by one card. But it is worried, of course, about being weak to dark, and the Galarian birds seem really good. The V and the one prizer. So if you can't, crumb their draw engine, especially if it's the Baby Moltres style decks, I think you're going to have a really bad time. And there's the likes of Gengar and Moltres V going into some Arceus builds, which seem very, very rough for you. So dodging dark is not going to be an easy recipe when we are probably putting Mew high up the tier list again, and no surprise there. So yeah, Dragapult is dodge and weave, but if ever we do tip the scales towards a lot of these Drizzle engines again, or other one prizes, the Dragapult is sort of the meta call to take, I think.
Definitely. Let's get rid of some of these tier 3 decks. I'm going to kick things off with Eternatus. It's really weird. Eternatus seemed like it was going to be actually a pretty decent winner from this set just because of Ultra Ball's existence. and it being a dark type. That's great in terms of dealing with Mew. That's great in terms of Crobat engines. Even Moltres gets better if you miss your Eternatus pieces. If you wanted to play a Moltres package, there's a lot of cool things going for Eternatus, but unfortunately, Galarian Zapdos just coming back into the format. It never really pushed Eternatus out of the format per se, because Path kind of did that. But Path and both of those cards existing, I guess, did that. So them both, Galarian Zapdos coming back into the format is really worrying. Path is still one of the better counters to Mew. It's not. I still don't think it's the greatest counter, but people will be adding it in naturally, as well as also adding it in to try and stop people being able to Starburst, which is obviously a big deal nowadays. As well as also the new Collapse Stadium, which is kind of a pretty nice one-of stadium if you're not too sure what stadium you want to play, to be able to get rid of some of your two prizes, to be able to disrupt the opponent. It's another stadium that Eternatus then has to worry about as well. There's also another fighting deck that's kind of appeared in the past couple of weeks, all built around Galarian Sirfetch'd. So again, that's another bad matchup. And naturally, yeah, it's just a bad time. Eternatus, for some reason, they keep printing these cards that just really hard counter Eternatus. And I don't know why, because I think it would have been a really interesting archetype to have like a Mega Ray in this format if like only one of those cards existed. But because all of those cards exist in so many different decks, it means like the top 2.5 tiers worth of decks all play some kind of counter to you in some capacity. So yeah, it's a really weird time to be an Eternatus deck when, like, realistically, your tier S matchup is probably pretty decent. It's just everything between tier 1 and 3 that you just want to dodge, which is it's a really weird place to be. Yeah, it's quite sad to be an Eternatus player, I think.
Yeah, let's truck through this tier 3 and talk about Turbo Genesect. Another one that actually gains a lot from Brilliant Stars. Ultra Ball is a great enabler for a Saucer game plan where you're actually attacking with your Genesects. Choice Belts is also like having an extra Toxtricity in play. So now you could reach those VMAX KOs much more reasonably, actually, if you just play like 2 Belts and like a 3/2 Toxtricity and have those tablets. You can actually get things done a lot more reliably than you previously could. So you can reach those big numbers, and Arceus isn't like the most difficult thing to hit into either with those tablet supports. It just feels like it is obviously an inferior Mew, because most of the time it's just because you don't boss turn 2 quite as easily as a Mew can, because it's just so low maintenance, whereas Genesect is constantly like panting towards discarding its next metal energy, getting its sources online, getting those switch outs and getting into the active position, and Mew doesn't have to worry about any of that. It can attach past turn 1 and still be happy with a boss play turn 2, and Genesect really is the opposite of that. So it's a lot more high maintenance of a deck, and despite being able to declog a lot easier, especially metal energy, it's still going to be just a far worse way to play Fusion Strike.
And speaking of, Mew is going to go straight back into TRS. We still think it is absolutely busted. It's been by far the best deck this format, and somehow they've made it even better by giving it Ultra Ball. That means all of these random sort of battle VIP passes and extra supporters you get clumped within your hand in the mid to late game, or even in the early game, you can just bin off. It's an immediate -3 if you want it to be, but sometimes it's even immediate a minus like 3 plus getting a Genesect on board, or getting a Mew VMAX, or getting a Meloetta. So that alone is insane. It gets Choice Belt, which is also good because it means you've permanently got one what was it called? Power tablet in play, which is great because it means that you need less push to be able to make it all the way to these 3 prize knockouts, which is huge, or even 2 prize knockouts. So yeah, that's really really big. And yeah, it's just that level of being able to kind of declump your hand. At the moment, like, lists are playing things like switching cups and ultra balls and that. Sorry, not ultra balls, great balls and that kind of thing. Whereas with ultra ball, it just smooths everything out. There are still like issues here and there, turn 1s where you get hands of absolutely nothing. But every deck does that. We've seen how powerful Mew is, and realistically, it upgrades upgrades great balls to ultra balls. Gets to even maybe pull away from the Chromatic kind of package in some capacity, because you can even play things like Luminion if you want to lean into some more maybe early game consistency for lack of draw power. That's something pretty fun you can do. So yeah, there's a couple of cool, really nice new options, but in general, just Ultra Ball declogging the hand means it's so much easier to draw 20, 30 cards in the first couple of turns with Genesect, and realistically, no deck can match that, to be honest. Even Arceus tutoring out the perfect 2 cards every turn sometimes isn't good enough, because you've found the perfect 2 cards plus the perfect 3, 4, 5, 6 cards as well, because you've just drawn so many. So yeah, Mew doesn't go anywhere, unfortunately, for people that don't like seeing Mew. It's still going to be the best deck in format, and if nothing else, it might even be better, to be honest.
Yeah, and a quick mention to double turbo, just meaning that Fan is
Yeah.
a way less good tech as well, because their cram heads can now get them into double turbo, and they can still be bossing you even from a no energy board state, which was one of the only things you could rely on in this format, and that's no longer possible. So that's also just an extra worry there. Let's talk about some of these fire decks, because this is the other sort of like flagship support coming out of this set, and Charizard is one of these things that I've banged my head against a wall with, honestly. I've really liked Suicune, so I thought naturally Entei would be of interest to me, and I do like that it can come out the gate swinging early. I'm just really frustrated by the lack of tutoring for the stadium, especially in those opening turns. So there'll be those games where you're just passing turn one and then you're not doing what you want to do as a tempo deck, so it's far less reliable than like a Suicune. Especially now, if you want to be like a tempo water deck, you can play Luminion, Crobat, and buckets and reliably get those waters in the discard pile a lot more than fire can, really. In terms of spaces into the deck, you need to play things like E-Search, which is just like way worse because then you need to find another one in the turn as well, whereas the bucket just fixes everything for you. So as a tempo deck, I kind of like this a lot less than the likes of Suicune Ludicolo or even Suicune Ice Rider. The V-Star power coming off from Charizard, you really need to lean heavily into the deck and just have like EXP Share, Raihan, as well as obviously the 4 Basins. So it sometimes whiffs on its tempo game plan. It's very easy to disrupt the one-shot game plan as well, just by gusting Charizard Vs or even V Stars. You know, it's not an insurmountable amount of hit points just to gust and hit for a one-shot for the likes of Mew, for obviously the water decks in the format as well. So we're going to put this like low tier 2. It's probably not even my favorite way to play fire right now. I feel like the Charizard just pulls us even further away from like that tempo route that I was saying earlier, and eats into a lot of those spaces. So the glamorous one shot probably isn't worth playing right now, and it's not like compelling enough into any matchup. The damage output that you can reach sometimes with that Charizard.
Yeah, and in a similar vein, I'm going to take a look at Arceus Charizard, which was kind of the big way that it was being built in Japan. Essentially, it kind of falls into a somewhat similar position. Basically, obviously, you have 2 V stars and you can only use 1 V-star power. So in the games you get to in the games you have to use Starburst to get into the game, you immediately lock yourself out from any kind of one-shot potential, because both of these Pokemon are capped at around 230, 260 with a band, which is, it's great damage, but it's also not a one-shot. So if you have to use Starburst in the early turns to get into the game, you can't then use Starblaze with Charizard later on in the game. And in the games we've found, in the games where you're able to get set up without Starburst and therefore be able to use the Starblaze on Charizard, typically you're probably ahead in that game anyway, so you don't really need this big comeback potential from a 2 prize sort of uptrade into a 3 prizer. So it's a really weird balance. Obviously, it's having an Arceus like shell is going to be brilliant regardless of the deck, and that's kind of what's keeping it in that tier 2, just because naturally you can build up some very, very chunky Pokemon that only give up 2 prizes. Obviously, Charizard is a decent attacker outside of its V-Star power, provided you've kind of done some set damage here and there, which Arceus can do, which the baby Charizard can do. There's ways to do it, and it does feel like sometimes there will be games where you are able to, similar to the Entei build, where you are able to get that big Charizard attack off, but it doesn't happen anywhere near consistently enough. And realistically, we don't think Arceus is the way to fix that, because a lot of the time you're using Arceus to be able to get to that point where you can't use the attack anyway. So yeah, it's a really weird blend, and we haven't particularly enjoyed playing the build too much. Obviously, they're 2 great cards, so it's kind of naturally going to be a decent tempo deck. But we don't think it's like the best way or even anything worth leaning into in terms of trying to get that Starblaze off.
Yeah, I actually like it best with the VMAX, just because you can be bossing Genesect and just doing the 100 damage 3 energy attack. It gets you can't do it against Oricorio builds of Mew, which is a shame. But I think that's actually like one of my favorite ways of doing it, where you just sit with a Charizard that's got 300 hit points, and you incentivize the Mew to ignore you, and then you can like base and attach, get the knockout with the VMAX. So yeah, I think you're right. The V Star just feels like an odd juggle to have because you very rarely get to use it. But the VMAX actually has some selling points, specifically into that Mew matchup, as being able to just ignore their active for a turn. They try and ignore you because you have 330 hit points, and then you can try and get that big attack late on. But that still relies on you like going first and getting the first prizes, which is difficult to do against Mew. Let's touch on Rapid Strike Mali, because I think this is like, for me, probably my most improved deck. I really didn't like it in this format. I didn't see a compelling reason to play it. But a couple big upgrades. Naturally, your matchup spread is smoothed out with the inclusion of Manaphy, and the deck already plays Ordinary Rod and Rescue Carrier. That should be a real pain for Urshifu and Jolteon, both not really known for playing many Gust cards. Like current builds of Melony play no boss, for example, and Jolteon is between that 1 and 2 count. So with your 2 recovery cards, you're gonna be a real problem for them. At the same time, they're taking out a Manaphy and not your Malamar, which means you're not having to spend cards to rebuild your board state a lot of the time, which means you're just going to have enough to one-shot, especially against Urshifu, which is weak to Psychic. And the low threshold of Jolteon as well isn't too shabby. So you're happy to see the spread decks now, which is really cool. And you're even a little bit safer against some of the Inteleon builds. I know things like Suicune could do some interesting plays by Raihanning to their Shady Dealing Inteleon, doing some quick shooting pings, and also getting a 20 damage attack off onto bench Inkay. So protecting against that really does make your matchup spread a lot safer. And what I think is really impressive is that you gain the new Cynthia's Aspiration card, which increases your damage cap as well quite a lot, into reaching 1-hit KOs much more reliably than previously. I think Malamar is excellent into every Arceus build we've tried so far. It's not found that 280 threshold too difficult at all, and it's also very good into a lot of these other like tempo 2 prizery decks that we've been trying a lot of, either because they're like trying to hit for weaknesses here and there to be like able to uptrade into Mew at times, and Malamar just being that one prizer can feast quite happily on those sorts of attacking decks. So yeah, it seems like a very safe and powerful deck with 1-hit KO potential. I think in our testing, it's been pretty decent into Mew. I will say Oricorio makes that breakpoint that little bit more difficult, especially if you're playing the Inteleon build of Malamar, because the Aspiration draws you up to 8, and then even with like nets being drawn and that sort of thing, going up to that extra Rapid Strike card in hand required to take a one-shot on Mew can be really awkward. So we'll see which one comes out on top. We've been testing mostly with the Inteleon branch, but I know there is a pull towards the Cincino build as well now. The Cincino build allowing you to play Boss's Orders potentially as well, which is like one weak point of Mali. You can only hit the face right now with the current builds, and you can choose to add in Persimmon or the quick shooting Inteleon for a little bit of extra finish off potential. But outside of that, I think you're mostly just hitting the face with this deck. But yeah, impressed by it, and I don't say that lightly because I really am skeptical of one prizes. But it feels like a compelling deck right now in this format.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting one. Again, I wasn't a fan of the deck at all, but well, pre this set, but kind of that puzzle solving aspect is a really nice one to pick up and play, because it's kind of been, I don't know, 6 months or so of just VMAXs slugging at each other with Intelli engines and nothing majorly different. So it's very refreshing, I guess, playing a one prizer. What should we take a look at next? I think Arceus Shadow Rider is actually one of the worst Arceus builds we've tried so far. Unfortunately, we're going to drop it in tier 3. It's kind of caught in the crossfire of one being a dark type, which is being weak to a dark type, which is kind of pretty scary. Just because obviously people are naturally looking towards dark to be a good counter anyway. So it makes your sort of late game potential a little bit more fragile. Arceus is definitely an improvement, and I think it's an improvement on sort of playing the Alcremie kind of stuff, because the Alcremie was very slow, Arceus gives the deck something to be doing on turn 2. It gives it some element of pressure, so you can't just sit there and kind of laugh at them for 3 turns because you know their damage is pretty pitiful. And by like that time, you've been able to take 6 prizes. Now Arceus does apply some pressure, which is good. But yeah, there's just we feel there's just better 1 psychic builds, 2 Arceus builds, and 3 sort of one-shot builds out there. So it's definitely a needed improvement to Shadow Rider, but I don't think it brings enough to the table. I don't think Whimsicott is a particularly good addition either. I think it's a very flashy card, but 1, it kind of gets caught in the crossfire again of being in a format with Manaphy, but 2, also you need to really commit to it the turn before, realistically, or like you need to have such a long gameplay that you are able to build up a board where you're Arceusing early, to then build up a board where you can Shadow Rider, have some Shadow Riders down, to then be able to Shadow Rider onto the Whimsicott, and that's all without using your V-Star power, which just sounds pretty unfeasible. I think the like locking aspect of the Whimsicott is kind of interesting, but there's plenty of decks out there that are going to run no special energy, and despite like double turbo and fusion energy being very popular right now, I don't think it's something to lean on into with Whimsicott, unfortunately. And yeah, again, Shadow Rise in a really weird spot, similar to Eternatus, where it obviously gains some great upgrades. It's definitely it was definitely one of the slowest sort of tempo decks in the format right now, and having Arceus to at least be doing something is really good. But just being caught in the crossfire and still, being subpar in all kind of the main reasons to play the deck, in its typing, in its partners, in its actual one-shot potential, just means that it kind of falls short on all 3 of those.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk about sort of like a faster Entei deck that's stripping away the Charizard, just trying to attack as quickly as turn 1 when you're the player going second, or very easily attacking turn 2 if you're the player going first. I do like that hit point threshold of a natural 230, especially if you go first into Arceus decks. It's a real problem for them because they're not able to use their double turbo to get their Trinity Nova off. They have to find alternate means of hitting you, and oftentimes that's like E-Switch Moltres plays with basic energy. So that's really nice already, just being kind of chunky. And if you want to, you can even add in like 1 of Cape, and you can be an annoying 2-prizer for them to deal with. That fleet-footed ability is good. We love the attack damage of the Rondo, especially because we have Choice Belt now, and you can sort of see that through into the late game, hopefully, with quick shooting pings. You have the 1-prizer of Moltres. There's a lot to sort of like here. The main sort of problem I see is that you still need to play things like Crobat in the opening turns if you want to have those pop-offs, because unlike the sort of like the Suicune deck where you can wait around that little bit more, at least old builds of Suicune, because you have the ludicolo, Entei doesn't have that luxury of space because it needs to play more basic energy so you can activate your Basin, and you need to play 4 stadiums, which Suicune currently plays like 1 or 0. And you need to play more switch outs than the Suicune deck plays because they just play nets. And you need to move in and out of your Enteis a lot more easily so that you can be rondoing. So, getting the most out of Basin to actually rondo. So it eats up a lot more space than the Suicune deck does. You're still having to put multiple 2-prizes into play, like Crobat, just so that you can hit Basin going second to be a tempo deck. So it's this awkward juggle where your damage output isn't quite enough on certain turns, like quickly enough. You can be good into knocking out like the likes of Mew and Genesect and stuff, but if you're presented an Arceus turn 2, that's a really annoying threshold, and you never really like 2-shotting stuff like that. So maybe Entei is more of like a toolbox and you try and put other things in, but our juggling so far with fire has mostly been unfruitful for the most part, and it seems to be done better in other ways, either by the likes of Galar and Moltres V or Suicune V. These seem like much better like pressure decks in the game, I think.
Yeah. Next up, we're going to take a look at Leonizard. Leonizard's one that's kind of been forgotten about since, since like Vivid Voltage, where it kind of was a bit of a splash in the pan hit. It hasn't been great since, but I think it gaining Manaphy and Choice Belt, and even Basin and Ultra Ball to a lesser extent. Basin to a decent extent, to be honest, but Ultra Ball to a lesser extent, means that it's actually a decent tier 2 archetype now. Obviously, let's kick things off by saying it's still a rare candy deck. It will naturally always have issues. There'll be games where your Manaphy is Gust KO. There'll be games where your Manaphy is prized. There'll be games where you're not able to get enough Pokemon down. You just lose to bosses, that kind of thing. We all know the caveats to these rare candy decks. But that aside, what does it gain? Like I say, it gains Magma Basin, which means you're able to not just rely on Raihan to be able to power one up in a turn, but also be able to power something up with a Raihan plus a Basin or without an attachment. It means your attachments are naturally a little bit more flexible, which is great. Gains Manaphy, so all of these kind of awkward sniping decks don't go away. They're not no longer a headache, but they're much less of a headache. Obviously, naturally, we're saying that maybe Jolteon is dropping down a little bit, but as I've already alluded to, it looks like Urshifu may be coming back in some capacity, so it's good to have Manaphy. And yeah, also Choice Belt is actually a really big one because it means that you don't need to play Leon to be able to deal 330 damage, which means that you're actually able to play something like a Raihan or something like that to be able to and still be able to KO a VMAX or a Mew more importantly than anything, which means that you have a little bit more time than you maybe once had, where you had to also factor in the fact that you have to have your setup kind of ready to go because you have to use a Leon and therefore no real draw supporter on the turn that you need to take this big KO. So a couple of really compelling things. Obviously, again, caveats, it's a one prize deck, but it's actually impressed me a little bit more than I expected it to. The deck has an insane amount of draw power as well, with Cinccino's, the Battle Sense Charizard. We've even added in a thin Altaria line as well to just be able to tutor supporters to the top to either discard if they're Leons with Battle Sense or draw into if we need them for the turn. And the deck, like turbos, it goes through the deck really, really quickly. And there's been a lot of games where before you've even started taking prizes, you're down to like sub 10 cards in deck just because of how quick that you can draw cards. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. There are issues, obviously, but I think it's definitely another one worth looking at. I think it's pretty interesting having it's kind of off the back of Minccino having Call for Family as well, means that we can naturally we don't just fold to not having enough Pokemon. As long as you find an energy, you can kind of say, oh, at least I can get my attacker out, or at least I can guarantee a Cinccino next turn or whatever. So yeah, there's a couple of really compelling additions to the deck. Nothing that's going to break the format. It's still a stage 2, but it's probably the best time. It's probably in the best place it's ever been. So and it's also a really fun one, to be honest. So yeah, it's a nice one to see back in tier 2.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't even look at this deck if the Minccino hadn't come out. That card is so huge for the deck. Let's tackle another stage 2 while we're on the topic. We're going to talk about Obstagoon Inteleon, which had some flash in the pan success, really. That was when Mew was first coming onto the scene and Dragapult was still in the meta, and Dark typing was just like good enough to get you through a lot of instances. And then we saw the rise of Jolteon and to an extent Urshifu Melony as well, and it kind of just completely died off. And although we are gaining that Manaphy, I think there's going to be other one prize decks around, and I do know that you have Inteleon and Obstagoon in your deck, so you can do some interesting like damage shenanigans against some of these fellow one prizes, but you are going to be slow out the gate, same as Charizard, why we're sort of keeping it down. It's weird to say that other one prizes in the meta are keeping some of these decks at bay, but that could easily be the case for the Obstagoon. I think consistency is still somewhat of a question mark here, and just the threshold of some of these V-Stars is a big problem. You were pretty happy like two-shotting V-Maxes, but you're definitely not happy two-shotting V-Stars, and I think that's like a big problem for the Obstagoon deck. So we're going to pop it down in tier 3, a little bit more well-rounded, and I'd hate to see it if I was a Mew player, but there we go.
I'm going to take on both of the single strikes at once because we think both of them are going to plant themselves back in tier 1. Basically, more than anything, single strike this whole time has been a great counter deck in terms of typing. It's been in a time where dark typing has been great since Mew, but also Dragapult and that kind of thing. But also fighting type has been a great type to counter, and nothing is changing. Arceus is weak to fighting, and Mew is still weak to dark. So single strike is already still running the best two types. It has been for the past like 6 months, and nothing has changed about that. So naturally, meta position is pretty good. But on top of that, basically the only card realistically they gain is Ultra Ball in most instances, but it is absolutely huge in terms of upping their consistency. A lot of complaints about Single Strike were its sort of issues with drawing and that kind of thing. And just having access to Ultra Ball means that you, one, are able to find the correct pieces of your multiple stage ones a bit easier. But two, it also means that you can play a bit of a heavier Crobat engine now, which naturally means that you're going to be a bit better at drawing through your deck, which is great. Obviously, there's differences between Single Strike, sort of an Urshi based build, and a Gengar based build. And I think there's justifying reasons to play both of them, to be honest. Obviously, Joe informed me of a really interesting stat that the Gengar build actually boasts the best win rate into Mew of the past few weeks in terms of tournament data. So that alone is great news. Obviously, you maybe lose some percentage points in these other matchups, but knowing that you're probably playing the best counter deck to Mew in a format where Mew could even be upwards of 15% of the room is going to be a really, really good feeling. Hitting like 2 auto wins, 3 auto wins maybe in a 9-round tournament is just so good in terms of trying to push you into day 2. But then, obviously, on the counter, we have the Urshifu side, which naturally has dark types in terms of Umbreon and stuff, which, again, a great counter, but obviously a little bit worse than Gengar. But also, you're then able to play a bit of a thicker line of Urshi to be able to deal with some of the Arceus variants, which, again, between all of the Arceus in the room, you've got to expect you're probably looking at 10 to 15%, maybe even more, given how flexible Arceus is. So like with both of these builds, you're going to be hitting some of the top like echelon of decks for weakness, which is really really good. I think there's still going to be issues here and there with their sort of in terms of whether they can still be consistent. Ultra Ball doesn't solve every single issue, but we've seen Single Strike be incredibly successful basically ever since post rotation. It was kind of the leader of the post rotation alongside Zacian Zam. So we know how this deck's built, and to be honest, it looks to be in a much more consistent place than before now that it gets to play Ultra Balls in high counts as well.
Yeah, really happy to see that inclusion. Seeing as though I invested in some Single Strike stuff, I was happy that Ultra Ball makes the deck a lot better. Let's talk about Duraludon. Duraludon's one of these decks that has done really well in the latter stages of this current format. We think it's going to stay up around that tier 1.5. Naturally, Duraludon's one of these decks that has to assess the format first before picking its moment to sort of strike. I do love the inclusion of Arceus V-Star now. It really suits my playstyle a lot more to play Arceus alongside Duraludon rather than just having Zacian and then this really scuffed engine of like Pokegears and Adventurous Discovery and that sort of thing. It makes me a lot more happy to play a Duraludon style deck where you still have this huge amount of meat to get through with your VMAXs and the caves and the big charms and that sort of thing. But you have tempo at your disposal again because you have Trinity Nova that can power you up, represent that prize race a lot more reliably and quickly. And yeah, you're a big 2-prize Pokemon, even bigger than the Zacian was with the Arceus as well. So you make the prize map even more difficult. You make the Mew player spend even more tablets in those opening stages, that sort of thing. So your matchup into Mew maybe getting even stronger than it already was, and you're just a better tempo deck. It did enjoy the Jolteon matchup to an extent as well, just because of the lack of basic energy in the Jolteon build that can sometimes slow them down in the openings and make their hands a lot more awkward. And obviously the Crystal Cave undoing a ton of their work. So seeing that kind of fall down the tier list isn't great. It's pretty good into the Mali just because of the lack of basic energy again. You don't even need to take 6 prizes in that matchup. You need to basically take 4 because you need to beat an ordinary rod plus 2 basic energy. And it's going to be decent into the Gengar. It's going to be not great into the Urshifu, although you do have the classic Avery and the Big Charm and stuff like that to try and help you get there. So you have outs into most of these archetypes. Against other Arceus builds, the mirror is actually pretty interesting because there's the balancing act of them having a ton of basic energy, but depending on which sort of flavor of Arceus they've gone for, they have various damage outputs. A lot of them don't have high like inherent damage, so Duraludon can still sit pretty for a while. And again, they have double turbos, which are really not helpful throughout the game as well. So we're still in that sort of analysis phase of Duraludon, but I really like the deck internally now. Like, I'm actually happy looking at the 60, whereas before I was like, vomit. This is just going into a format style deck to flip over your opponent's active Pokemon and see how good your matchup is. I think there's still an element of that, but at the same time, you're at least keeping more decks honest by having turn 2 pressure and allowing you to power up that V on the bench safely and just make sure that you have a chain of attackers going with that Starbirth to fall back on. It's just a much nicer deck to look at and will be much more reliable. And another note is that Hyper Potion is just an extra buff now to the deck in terms of its healing potential, because you have double turbo energy that you can attach to Duraludon, then hyper pot it off, and that can be really nice in combination with the caves and stuff for buying back free turns, especially against like Max Miracle and a few other of these like lower damage output pokey attacks that people can throw at you with their like alternate attackers basically when they don't have their special energy online. So yeah, it seems very good. It's kind of lying in wait. I could easily see this jumping up to 1. We're just sort of having to see what's the most popular and what's not.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Togekiss. We're going to drop that in 1.5, and admittedly, it's something that we still really want to test out a lot more. It's kind of in that same position as Duraludon, where we're pretty happy with the concept. We're still ironing out a list and kind of working out exactly how we want it to work. But realistically, you can get to a point with Togekiss where if your opponent can't do 340 damage per turn, you can enter a loop, which essentially it's only 30 damage, potentially 60 with a band per turn, but it's an infinite loop of damage, which means that basically if you can't one-shot a Togekiss with a big charm, you're not going to be able to win the game because there's going to be nothing else on the board for you to be able to take prizes on. So that kind of loop looks pretty scary because there's not many decks that can easily one-shot a Togekiss VMAX, especially probably twice in the late game when they've used a lot of their resources. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. This is definitely one I want to explore more as well, just because I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting cards you get to play within the build in terms of like building roadblocks and forcing more resources out of the opponent. It's going to feel like, I don't want to call it attacking walls because it's not as blatantly a wall as like something like Safeguard or anything, but essentially Togekiss is going to be one of these just absolute like, well, it's just gonna be impossible to get through. That basically means that you're chipping away turn after turn, and you're going to be able to play, like I say, some really funky cards to try and use as much of your opponent's resources before you get to that sort of infinite state where they just can't take prizes on you. There's definitely still going to be issues, I think, but it's a combo that can finally be achieved with double turbo, and that might be enough sort of worth exploring to kind of bring it out and make Togekiss finally good, because it's a fantastic card. Being able to tutor for all of these pieces as well is going to be really important. I know Sander has tweeted in the past about something similar to this. I think it's a lot more wall based than actually taking prizes, but I think even he intends on taking prizes with an archetype like this. So if it's getting noticed by Sander, I really do think there's something there. And yeah, being able to just present basically an unwinnable board state sounds really, really good in this format. Especially when, you know, there's so many decks that can kind of do so many different things. If just fundamentally they can't deal 340 damage, then it doesn't matter all of the flashy things they can do. They just can't get there. So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting one to see whether we can sort of unlock that archetype. But if it can be unlocked, I think it looks to be pretty strong, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to take Suicune Ludicolo. I think it's a huge beneficiary of Jolteon possibly falling down that tier list a bit, because there's been times when Suicune Ludicolo was, up there in like the second, third, fourth best deck, but Jolteon's popularity really spiked and pushed it a little bit further down the tier list in the latter stages of the fusion meta. But I think an easy include of good old Manaphy here seems to do the trick in that instance. You're much safer into the Rapid Strike matchup in that instance as well. I think your damage output is phenomenal with your Ludicolo option to help you knock out V-Stars and the VMAXs that are still relevant in the game. And I think with Choice Belt now as well, it's much less easy for Mew, almost impossible for Mew, actually, I think, to stay out of range in terms of the amount of bench that's required for them to maintain a race against you and draw enough cards to continue attacking and whatnot. I think they naturally will fall prey to that wide board state. Oftentimes they will just for tempo attack turn one, for example, and just fall into that trap the entire time. So even just like one choice belt coming into this list makes me feel a lot more comfortable into that Mew matchup. Because let's face it, the Cape of Toughness really wasn't doing much unless you had like the path in here as well, and I just don't think that's the right approach to have. You want your fleet-footed cards because you're a combo deck for the most part. So yeah, big fan of Suicune. I think it really is safer in the meta game again, and you could potentially go down the route where you try and work towards Crobat and Lumineon to have turn one pressure going second. But from what we found, I think it's better to keep the board spaces open just for more Sobbles and more Lotads. So your opponent doesn't have like the easy boss of the lone Lotad in play. You want to keep those slots wide and sometimes force that 7 prize game as well, where you can only have one Suicune down at the time, one gets KO'd, you can make the Raihan plays, or even now you can attack with Manaphy. You can ludicolo Manaphy and hit for 120 for one attachment, so you don't even need to have the Raihan open to be able to force that race and set up a VMAX for 100 damage or take a 1 prizer out, that sort of thing. So another interesting adaptation to Suicune. Seems really good to me in the format and much safer all round.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Tool Drop as one of the rogue decks we're going to pop on the list. Unfortunately, I just think the multiplier isn't enough. We're not going to spend too much time on this one, but yeah, the multiplier isn't enough. 30 times is not enough when in a format where you need to be hitting to like 70 to 80. That's 9 tools. Admittedly, that's just a couple of Honchkro's on the board, like fully stocked up. I think it's called Boss's Pockets is the ability, which is brilliant. I almost want to play the deck just for that, but unfortunately, past being in the format, Boss, like you realistically you have to like spread your capes out because you can't put all of your capes on one Honchkro because they'll just boss the other one and take off a load of tools. So you have to like spread your capes out, and then you have to deal with like I say, things like path and stuff like that. You have to deal with Pachirisu not being a one energy attacker. So yes, you naturally can play things like Flaffy or Raihan or EXP share, but none of these are particularly like super consistent. We've seen. I think Raihan is the best out of all of those, and realistically, you don't want to be Raihaning every turn because eventually you just won't be able to like boss for turn or whatever, like anything like that. So yeah, it's if the multiplier was a bit more of an incentive, then maybe I think we could be looking at something because Honchkrow is honestly a great Pokemon in terms of being able to store these tools on, and it's pretty unkillable when it has a bunch of capes of toughness on. But realistically, that 30x multiplier just isn't enough for us to be justifying trying to get 2 energy per turn on a Pachirisu.
Yeah, there's way better single prize decks. One that's slightly better is going to be Mad Party. I know there's a lot of hype around this just because Ultra Ball's out and we finally have some more cannon fodder. We've tested it a bit, and unfortunately, Crobat isn't Dedenne. That's a big twist. I know some of you weren't expecting that, but I still find it difficult for you to ramp damage in those opening stages to the point where you can KO V Pokemon, especially the chunky ones that are trying to evolve, you know, the 220 hit points of the Arceus, etc. That is a huge issue for you. Your hit points are still very low. As you can see, there's still a decent amount of Inteleon on the list here and there, so you're going to have a rough time in that instance. You're still very reliant on the likes of Crobat and whatnot. Now, we are adding in Collapsed Stadium to our list as a one-of to try and clear those off the board, but you're not a Puritan one prize deck, and we know that Mew, when it wants to boss, it will boss and race you fairly well. They can jump back into the deck in those opening stages or just use the Meloetta against you, depending on the situation, how many marchers you're looking like getting into the bin, or the parties, I should say. So yeah, your damage is just low in those opening stages. It takes a good few turns for you to get into a decent board state, and you're naturally having a really bad time against Intel engines and other one prize decks that are just going to race you like fairly well. Doesn't feel that compelling to me. Still a little bit bricky in those opening stages.
Yeah. Another one prize deck. It might be the last one we're talking about. I can't tell, but it's going to be Torterra. Torterra is another rogue one, which I think again a lot of people will be a little bit sad to see. It looks to be pretty interesting. It's one of the best stage 2 attackers we've had like ever. Maybe it's got an insane multiplier of 50x the number of evolutions on the board. But again, it just requires too many pieces. having to be able to chain the Torterras, because even 190 HP is not enough to be able to reliably think you're going to take a hit in this format, which is crazy, but it's a thing. So being able to chain Torterras, which need 2 energy, so you then have to work out how you're going to be attaching at least 1, sometimes 2 energy per turn just to keep up, is really important. Obviously, you probably, like, realistically, I think Inteleon is one big selling point of the deck, so you have to then fit in like an Inteleon engine to try and smooth that out. And just like it all just turned out to be just a little bit too much. It's a really, really interesting one prize archetype, and I feel like if we have some kind of, you know, well, some kind of better energy acceleration for grass types that isn't like Cherrim or something like that needs to be on the board. I feel like we actually could see something there. Again, it's only a stage 2, so it's probably still capped at that like tier 2 level or whatever. But it feels really, really close. But it's unfortunately in this format, close is not good enough. And we're in a format where we can actually play one prizes now. So there are one prizes that outclass it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Let's go on to one that I'm super interested in. This is more theory than our actual testing just now, but one of our teammates has played this archetype. I really get the theory behind it, and I can foresee it coming on leaps and bounds in this format, and that's going to be the Galarian Surfetch deck that is featuring Galarian Zapdos and Galarian Moltres as having 2 great type coverages, basically doing the whole single strike thing, but with mostly 1 prizes, with Surfetched being that 2 prize option. That actually gives you a turn 1 going second play of 200 damage, and potentially even more if you want to play Choice Belt, which is a bit of a high roll, but there you go. It's open to you. And 200 is a good enough number for at least the likes of Genesect. It's, I don't think, enough to get through the Mew because of the resist, but still decent. And you can easily play a Galarian Zapdos V in this deck as well, because I think Zapdos is just an inherently very strong card in this format. For just a 1 energy attachment, potential uptrade into the Arceuses, can knock out Crobats, that sort of thing, so it seems very good. And this is a deck that's utilizing a Cinccino engine, which I also think is getting way better this set, just because we have the improvement on Minccino, which means you can get into multiple on those opening stages a lot more reliably as well. So there will be those matchups where if Mew is playing no hand disruption, you basically yawn through the game and just try and have 1 prizes drawing you as many cards as possible, like just literally getting Cinccino's down, make sure that you can knock out their Meloettas in the openings and just set yourself up to Moltres them twice with the baby Moltres. Pretty easy to do, actually, when they play 0 hand disruption. You're just solitaring and just using as many make-dos as possible. Not very difficult, especially when you play so much recovery for your Cincinos and Mincinos. You don't even mind just hitting like the Meloetta for 40 over a number of turns, to be honest. It's actually fine. And you have great fighting type coverage for Arceus now as well, which is really, really good. So you have great type coverage. You're doing the 1 prize non-interactive thing against Mew, and you have inherent good damage output from that Galarian Moltres, which I think is just, again, it's one of these cards that I'm trying to weave into as many decks as possible, because I just think it's so good, not only as like a Mew threat from like turn 2, but is a threat in the late game against a ton of V-Stars and VMAXs even, as we get into those latter stages, and gives you a really good damage output later on, especially with the Choice Belt as well.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Victini. Victini kind of saw a bit of success again towards the end of this format, but neither of us have ever been a huge fan of Victini. Obviously, things like Magma Basin do make it a little bit better, but the numbers for Victini just are terrible into V-Stars. The fact that you're like having to 2-shot a 2-prizer whilst they're 2-shotting a 3-prizer, and realistically, you have to be like bossing to try to kind of even the prize trade is kind of just not very nice at all. Your hammers are a little bit worse in a format full of Arceus. Obviously, there's still some matchups where hammers are going to be useful, but in a world where Arceus can accelerate a load of energy, that's going to be an issue. Also, again, we mentioned earlier on that Mew gets double turbo, which means that hammers are naturally, hammers and fans and that kind of thing are naturally less effective these days as well. So yeah, it's not the best fire archetype, and we don't think it's the best disruption archetype either. Again, we've never been the biggest fan of the archetype either way, but there seems to be better ways to lean into things like Magma Basin and stuff in terms of ways to like make those cards good with things like Entei and stuff. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but Victini still is not on our radar really.
Yeah, I'm just going to cover the last Moltres deck because I've been gushing over it this entire video. And this is literally a tier 1.5 deck we think is basically just the Galarian Bird Show, where we're trying to give the smackdown to Mew pretty hard. But actually, we're just two decent attackers in our own right by having Choice Belt involved in the deck now. You just have much better numbers on the Galarian Moltres V. You can knock out a ton of V Pokemon and just trade into them basically. And with the help of the Raihan coming in here and there, you can make sure that you're constantly up on energies. You have the Clara plays with Galarian Molt as well in the sort of later game for the high damage output threshold. You have Hooper that can be really good into single prize matchups like the Mali. It can help you deal with Meloetta as well in one hit, which is really good. It can offer tempo against other decks using Sobbles and Mincinos and that sort of thing. And yeah, there's a variety of ways you can just try and make these birds work. You can do the same thing that the Surfetch deck does, which is just have a ton of Mincinos in here, cycle through the deck, and yawn your way through Mew just via the Baby Bird. But also you can use Big Bird to sort of speed up that race and just make things happen, essentially. You can try and just play Crobats and Luminion and Eldegoss and those sorts of things because you have a variety of one prize Pokemon in the deck anyway. You can force that odd prize race issue and at least force Gust all over the place, which is nice. So yeah, you have turn 1 tempo from Hooper. You have great like turn 2, 3 tempo with the Galarian Moltres, and the Baby Molt then becomes an instant threat in the late game. So tons of ways you can try and build this. It's why we kind of like the Dark Arceus anyway, that just how good the Moltres is regardless in the game. This is trying to go even lower to the ground, even kind of faster pace. And yeah, seems like a pretty good deck. Not quite like perfectly well rounded, especially into some of these other VMAX matchups where your numbers just aren't great. Sometimes you're forced to like boss around the place, and you're really panicking with your make dos or your Bibarel, or just crobatting hard to try and boss around the big stuff until you're in the right range of prizes for your opponent to baby molt them. But outside of that, I'm pretty happy with just a pure bird deck. I could actually see myself playing this in Liverpool from what we've tested, just because the theory is there that it's just gonna at least cakewalk Mew in a lot of instances, and be trying to just race other decks.
Yeah. I'm going to take on the last Arceus variant in the grass sort of box, where you're able to play things like the Shaman V Star and Flygon V. So both of those cards have been indicated to us in our testing that they actually have real potential if kind of left unchecked. The Flygon is a great VMAX sort of opposition, doing 320 kind of uncontested, which is brilliant. And then that means you can just plant a Shaman and basically see it ignored, so they focus on the Flygon, and then Shaman comes in to do a load of damage. It looks really interesting. It's playing with a lot of pieces, it's spinning a lot of plates, and that has been one of the biggest downsides so far. But Arceus does kind of glue it all together in a lot of instances, which is cool. We really think Shaman is a card not to be slept on, to be honest. The damage output it produces is pretty threatening. And whilst I think Flygon is maybe a little bit memeier than what it needs to be, I think the archetype is very close to actually being really solid, because having an early game Arceus sort of package and then late game just a sweeper in a super low maintenance Shaman, I think sounds very appealing. Like I say, there's enough people being able to boss in the format pretty consistently that you can kind of be kept off of exactly what you want in a lot of instances. So I think something a little bit lower maintenance than Flygon may be what the deck needs in terms of those VMAX matchups. But again, like I say, Arceus glues it all together, and to be honest, basically any deck that misses a turn of bossing is in a real difficult position, because they've kind of dealt with your Arceus, but they're either dealing with one of two Shamans, which the other one is just going to come in and sweep, or dealing with the choice of Shaman versus Flygon. And realistically, both of those can do huge amount of damage in the late game. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. Again, like I say, spinning a lot of plates and missing an early Flygon or early Shaman can kind of mean that you're presenting a board that can easily be sort of crippled by a single boss. But in a similar vein, on the in the inverse, if anyone misses a boss, it really does create sometimes very checkmate board states because you just present two very strong late game attackers sort of out of nowhere, just being able to power them up pretty efficiently with Arceus in the early turns.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is just keeping enough energy actually in your deck to be able to, like, if the first Flygon goes down, have the next Flygon actually powered up, because that's when you are representing the Shaman Flygon both able to one-shot if, like, they carry the active or the Flygon, like the second one that you present. But you need to play, like, 12 basic energy as well as your double turbos to make that happen. And even then, you might need, like, the Raihan on top. So it's a bit more combo-y than some of these others, but I do love that damage output. You're spot on there. Let's talk about the sort of Suicune Hammers Disruption deck. Obviously happy to see Jolteon falling a little bit, but not too happy to be seeing Arceus everywhere, because these are big two-prize Pokemon, and when you're sacrificing the Ludicolo for Disruption, it's not a great trade-off when they have inbuilt acceleration and can go from a 0 energy board to a Trinity Nova to like a 6 energy board straight away into you. That's troublesome. I think possibly some Cape of Toughness could improve this matchup. Arceus doesn't really want to play Tall Scrapper. It may be forced to based on where the format goes, how many like tempo 2Es we're seeing out here. I kind of like it as a game plan in general, but I also really like just playing Arceus instead as being an inbuilt Cape of Toughness that has Starbirth on top. That's pretty good. So I think Suicune is kind of troubled by this V-Star coming out, kind of troubled by some of the one prizes coming out as well that just have high damage output thresholds. The hammers are slightly worse against Mew because of double turbo as well, so I just think what it's trying to do is probably worse than the Ludicolo build as we go ahead into the format.
Yeah. Let's take a look at Leafeon. Leafeon is one of these archetypes that actually got a V-Star and already has a V-Star out right now, so you can toy around with the deck right now. Obviously, it does get some improvements from things like Choice Band and Ultra Ball as well, but one big thing is basically that Leafeon V-Star being able to boss at any point in the game without using your supporter is huge. And it really leans into the Leafeon's game plan because it likes to pick up these two prize Pokemon pretty easily from the bench in the early turns to try and disrupt the opponent's setup. A lot of these sort of two retreat, three retreaters, plus a Galar means that they're all kind of in range, which is cool. But even one retreat Pokemon with a Galar and a Choice Band, a Choice Belt, pushes it up to 210. So yeah, with an Inteleon ping here and there, maybe, or maybe even just with that raw damage alone, you're able to take some cool KOs here and there. So that's good. And also, again, we've mentioned both the single strikes and an Arceus build really like playing Umbreon right now, and this is one of the best counters to Umbreon. So naturally, Leafeon gains some pretty cool toys. It's still a bit inconsistent, and obviously Mew has kind of always been the thorn in its side ever since Fusion Strike was released, having 0 retreat, being able to one-shot you back, and in the worst, in the like sort of the worst come to the worst from the Mew player, they can just shuffle themselves back in because you're capped on your damage output, so you can never one-shot a Mew. Basically means that that matchup is still a very, very tough mountain to climb. But I'm looking at a lot of the sort of tier 1, tier 1.5 matchups, and honestly, I'm pretty okay seeing a lot of them. It still feels a little bit upsetting not being able to take two prizes on a V-Star without some prior damage or anything like that. And I think that will probably be the downfall of the deck, and the reason why we're putting it in tier 2 is just because typically the damage output is just ever so slightly not enough to be able to compete super efficiently with Arceus. But some of these old VMAX decks still really do fold to like turn 2 boss from a Leafeon, and now you can do that without even having to boss. So it means you can use your Ivy Star in the early games while you're still building a board, and that's when you can just go sort of boss the following turns because you've done all the drawing you need for the game. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. Again, it doesn't like it's not going to be breaking the format down, but I think against some of these VMAX decks that basically aren't Mew, it's still one of the better counters out there, to be honest.
Yeah, speaking of counters, let's talk about Sylveon, which is trying to be that type coverage, countery box style deck. I think it's kind of fallen on its face a few times just because of lack of consistency. But now gaining a really good colorless type in Arceus, you can have much better turn twos than previously, much more often. So I kind of like Sylveon in that sort of tier 2 category. I think especially if Manaphy only features in the one prize decks and doesn't quite make it into like the single strikes or just the Drizzle engine style decks that force or like that don't want to make the space for the Manaphy. Urshifu in this list is gonna run away with some matchups because it's still really good at knocking out Crobats and Luminions, which there may be more of them sort of sitting around on the board, but you have other aspects to your game. You have a couple Galarian Moltres in there. You have just the Sylveon itself that can attack and can force itself back down to a 2-prizer. You have Arceus that can be a chunky 2-prizer as well now and can accelerate energy around the board. You know, put 1 energy on an Urshifu, put 1 on a Sylveon after attacking with an Arceus. That's really, really good value. And you have the turn 1 ability of the Sylveon V to get you into Incense. So a lot of good ways to guarantee that V-Star for turn 2, which is really, really nice. So Sylveon in the beginning of Fusion Strike actually came out the blocks swinging. It was doing really, really well and punished like the early decks of the format just by virtue of having split damage from a little bit of spread in there, but also a ton of type coverages. And I could foresee that happening again, to be honest. Sylveon's a pretty captivating card because you have some great inherent abilities and engine Pokemon filling your board just to improve Sylveon's damage output. And it means that you can hit for a variety of pretty interesting weaknesses right now.
Yeah. Let's take a look at water control. Obviously, control is kind of the bane of some people's existence and the absolute love of some people in terms of like decks they like to play. And again, it's 2 sets in a row where control really has gained some very interesting tools. Primarily, this set it gained the Floatzel, which is already a water type, which is kind of one of the best types to be in these water control in these control boxes because there's already some great water Pokemon to be playing. But also, it really alleviates having to play things like Morpeko and the Dialga in the metal deck because it just lets you grab 2 items from the discard pile and pop them back into your hand. So that's a fantastic tool in terms of being able to get more crushing hammers, that kind of thing. All of these disruptive cards. We haven't seen too much from Control, and admittedly, we haven't like done the most testing with this because it's still like in our initial testing. The biggest hiccup was Mew gaining double turbo meant that you couldn't keep them off attacking for a turn, which is kind of what you needed to do. If you could keep them off attacking for a turn, you could then really try and force like push on that pressure point and get rid of more of their energy. But the fact that they can just double turbo and attack you again really provided a lot of unwarranted pressure that the control deck struggled to deal with in the initial stages of our testing. Again, similar to that Togekiss deck, we need to do a bit more testing. We need to iron out a list. But we're getting to the point where there is a critical mass of fantastic control-based cards, and it's only like it feels like we're only 1 or 2 cards away, if any, from being able to have all of those pieces you need to be able to really control a board state. Obviously, naturally, things like Arceus are always going to be a bit of an issue, being able to always tutor out the perfect 2 cards or accelerate a load of energy. So it's not going to be the easiest road for sure, but again, like I say, this critical mass of control cards is really, really starting to build now, and I think we're not far away from being able to actually see control decks at least, taking wins here and there, whereas at the moment they haven't really been seen to be doing too much in the Fusion Strike meta. Like I say, double turbo is still an issue that I think we're actively trying to work on, but I think we're getting to the point where there's a lot of very, very interesting loops you can do with control. Obviously, the Zoroark engine isn't ideal. We've had much better engines in the past, and I'm sure we'll have better ones in the future. But Zoroark is at least pretty flexible, so it means that you can pick up things like Seeking or Floatzel or Azumarill or whatever you decide to play in your box and get them at the right time. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. We're not certain that it's going to be like super impactful, but we're pretty sure that Floatzel is a huge upgrade for the deck overall.
Yeah, and even the Roseanne's backup's another really nice include for control. Like you said, it's coming to that critical mass, and it's down to Sander to break it essentially. Let's talk about some Urshifus. I think the one we're sort of most interested in is probably you guessed it, Galarian Moltres build. we really like this card, believe it or not, and it gives you some great avenues to play against Mew. Obviously, is what you're going for here, and in general, this is one of those. So, are you even playing the Manaphy? Because if not, I'm doing just those good Urshifu things again. And the deck actually gains Ultra Ball, which is massive for having those outs for the Moltres, but also because you normally play lower to the ground engine. You sacrifice the Inteleon, you play Crobat, you play Luminion, and you play Artillery, basically, and that's it. Because you need to surrender some space to have enough Dark Energy in the deck to actually make the Moltres work for you. But I think it's solid. It's been pretty okay in testing. Still not like the most consistent deck because you are trying to piece together things all over the place. And Raihan is retroactive rather than Melony, which is proactive, which is a bit awkward. But you still can do those big snipey plays and set up some really intimidating board states for different archetypes. You have that fighting type coverage, which is good into Arceus and Gengar to an extent as well. And if you can get those birds online quickly enough against Mew, it's a completely different win condition to just regular Urshifu. So, yeah, pretty interesting deck. Still one to iron out, I think, for me. These three decks, just all in a row, doing the sort of fighting plus dark thing, or just the dark thing in general, all really are piquing my interest. And I think a lot of people will have a similar mentality. Looking at some of the earliest tournaments going into Brilliant Stars, I think it's a no-brainer that Mew is going to be popular, and it's a no-brainer that you need to figure out ways to counter it. So seeing which counter deck sort of comes out on top and is the most well-rounded will be another really interesting puzzle to figure out.
Yeah. Let's talk about, I guess, the other Urshifu variant. We'll talk about that real quick. Obviously, the other way to build Urshifu right now is the Melony build. I think we're pretty convinced that in general, there's enough reasons to be playing the Dark build now with Ultra Ball and E-Switch and that kind of stuff, that it's a better engine than just trying to Melony per turn. Obviously, there's still benefits to Melony, and naturally, instead of hitting Dark type, that Dark type weakness, which is evidently better than Water type weakness. Admittedly, it means that like you can play kind of weird water attackers. I've seen a really interesting like hybrid Suicune Urshifu list over the past couple of days that's been doing like quite well. So that's like obviously there's different aspects to what you can play with that. Well, depending on what package you decide to power up your Urshifu with. But yeah, we are more convinced on the Dark build. I think naturally the lower consistency of Melony again is kind of going to fruition here. At the end of the day, you're only drawing 3 cards, and Urshifu still is, I think, to all intents and purposes, a bit of a combo deck because you're trying to build these very, very powerful turns. So I think that's naturally going to lend itself more so to a deck that can play a heavier Marnie and research count rather than just drawing 3 cards and hoping you see it all. Along with like Inteleons getting you the pieces here and there, because like you have no backup plan, whereas the backup plan with the Moltres list is you're still a 220 HP Pokemon hitting 220 a turn, which is like nothing to sniff at. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. Another thing worth noting for both of these builds is obviously the inclusion of like the Sonic Legs promo Urshifu as well. I think that's something that's kind of appeared over the past few weeks, but we very much back it in kind of a split count because it's really good at setting up some damage in some of these other matchups for then being able to finish off with Urshifu. So yeah, I think Urshifu is now the prevailing kind of snipe deck over Jolteon on the whole. But I think, yeah, you can kind of see how we've tiered them within the tiers, and we feel like the Dark build is better than the Jolteon build, but Jolteon is probably still better than the Melony build overall.
Yeah, let's talk about some other Ice Rider builds. We've touched on Arceus, and there's nothing to say that Arceus can't feature like less in these other ones already that we're about to mention. But the one that we've already spoken about is really like trying to attack with that Arceus that bit more. I'm actually really enjoying a Suicune Ice Rider, which is trying to be that tempo deck. We've mentioned a bunch about just having that tempo, and I think Fire was trying to fill that void for me. Dark is doing it somewhat here and there. There's even that Surfetched, which can randomly high roll. There's random Zapdoses coming out of nowhere now, Galarian Zapdos, if people go wide with V Pokemon. But I think Suicune just does that job better than before now that you have Ultra Ball at your disposal. easier discards for water. Lumineon gets you Melony. It really doesn't take much. You have the extra panic fleet-footed cards to start your game with more than just the 7 that you see in front of you. So you get rolling very, very swiftly. You can initiate a prize race, which we know is oh so important against the likes of Mew these days. You can easily insert some ropes. It's definitely a card that I'm loving in this format. I'm playing it in the fire decks. I'm playing it in like some of my Moltres decks, and also in the Suicune deck, so you can try and push away the Meloetta that the opponent inevitably puts into your face if they're a Mew player going first, and you can make sure that you can be knocking out the Genesects and the Mews early on, which is a really big deal. With Choice Belt, you have much higher threshold with that Rondo. Even with only a couple of bench Pokemon down, you can be getting nicely in range. And then you have Ice Rider as the follow-up. Now that we have that Leon potential, it seems very good to me. So I'm expecting the deck to be playing either just like a ton of Bats and Eldegoss and Lumineon and those sorts of things, and just like having the baby Mew, which is a one prizer that we're really enjoying in this format for helping us dig towards, you know, buckets and ball search cards and that sort of thing. Or you could potentially play Cincino, because again, I really like Cincino in this format. With the better Mincino, it feels like a great Pokemon to just shove in the active position if you're the player going first. And it's not a bad consolation if you're going second with it. You can at least grab a couple Pokemon and put them into play and go wider with that Cincino approach. So I really like that as an option. And then Ice Rider has that higher damage output threshold that Suicune sort of yearns for, and doesn't rely on like a rare candy approach that can be disrupted by the opponent just by like Marnieing and whatnot. So yeah, I think Ice Rider Suicune as a tempo deck is also super appealing, and is keeping most things honest in the game. I think realistically not great into some one prize matchups, which is pretty awkward, and could be awkward against sort of just trying to tempo out and race things, and it's not always going to come off where you have the floating attachment to actually make the Leon play happen against Mew. But I've even tried to sneak in some cross switches, which is another thing that I've liked to play with before with Ice Rider, and I think that's another interesting avenue to explore.
And the other Ice Rider build is kind of that more traditional Ice Rider Inteleon. Essentially, the crux of the issue with this kind of build is, more than anything, the Inteleon engine, I think, is a little bit slower than it was. I think we're pretty convinced that in this kind of build where you're going to be playing heavy Ultra Ball and that kind of thing to activate Melony, that just playing these 2 prizes naturally feels better because you're getting more value out of them. You don't really... you're not upset at Ultra Balling out something like a Sobble turn 1, but realistically, in a lot of instances, you're going to want to be trying to get more value for money, value for card, per se. So I think we're pretty convinced that it's the one of the worst Ice Rider builds to kind of be playing right now. There's benefits to the Inteleon engine, of course, but we're in a position where it's easier to get these 2 prizes out, and it's easier to prep the Melony with the cards that get the 2 prizes out. So realistically, it feels like you're adding in an additional step of sort of layer of issues to try and fit in this great engine that used to be, well, great engine that still is, but used to be great in the Ice Rider builds. We feel like it's just better off being a full house 2 prizer engine now.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be dropping Zacian Zamazenta into kind of the top of tier 3. It's been, again, performing reasonably well, being that chunky Pokemon in the game. But I think Duraludon is doing a much better job now that Arceus is coming out for that purpose. And I think Zamazenta is doing worse because Arceus is a presence in the game. Also, there's going to be some high damage output one prize decks out there. The Moltres is going to be super annoying to play against. The Rapid Strike Malamar, very annoying to play against. Suicune is getting an uptick as well. You didn't dislike the Jolteon matchup because you had the caves and whatnot. It was basically a stadium war a lot of the time. And normally it would be like reasonable for you. And I think your matchups are just getting worse across the board. Zamazenta's becoming a much worse card. The only real gains you get from this set is like Ultra Ball, which every deck gets. And even then, you don't really necessarily need that because you play so few Pokemon anyway. I don't even know if Ultra goes in, to be honest. You do have the new Zamazenta, which can give you some higher damage output in the sort of late game, but that's really not a big enough draw for me to expect this deck to do much better. And I think it's starting to decline. And the more V-Star mechanic Pokemon we get, it's only going to make Zamazenta a worse card.
Yeah. And finally, we have Raichu. Raichu, we're going to drop in tier 3. Unfortunately, again, it's a really, really interesting sort of concept. Raichu actually has insane damage potential, to be honest, being able to trade up pretty efficiently. But the issue is, again, one, boss means that they can kind of target your energy and somewhat cap your damage output. Two, not trading great into V-Stars is pretty awkward because obviously you're only taking 2 prizes and you're needing basically as many energy in a lot of instances as you are for 3 prizes, sometimes one less, but realistically, like, it's not going to be too different. And 3, just in general, it takes like 1 or 2 turns to be able to initiate some kind of board state that is threatening, which is fine if you're able to leave 1 prize in the active. But the problem is the only way you're getting to that board state is usually by leaving a Raichu or a Boltund in the active. And because of that, that means you're going down 2 prizes before you can even set up a board state that is representing any kind of threat. Obviously, again, we're in a position where we have better ball search for things like Flaffy, and we have Manaphy to kind of protect the Mareeps and Flaffies and that kind of thing. So it's probably never been a better time to be a Flaffy deck, but admittedly, the engine of the deck, having to leave a 2 prizer in the active, is not ideal.
Yeah, so that just about wraps things up. Really long video. Hope you guys enjoyed our ramble about the format. Me and Jack are both keeping an eye on Liverpool. It's not been cancelled yet, and we're crossing our fingers. Really excited to get back to IRL. I've been playing so much Pokemon recently. It's really just been on my mind 24/7 about random tech includes here and there and how it can adapt matchups. So we've been playing a ton online as well, streaming Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, trying to make a habit of that. So make sure you check out the Twitch for those things. We're showing off a ton of new deck lists and running them into old favorites as well as new spice into new spice, and we're trying to nail down some of these lists. There's still much more to uncover. Some of these decks we've talked about today have been more theory than gameplay, although we've got a lot of games in already in this format. I feel like we've had easily like over 100, probably close to like the 200 range, I think, overall in our friend group now, and we have a lot of results to go off of. We're trying to record everything, and based on our data, Mew is still busted. So we'll see how things adapt, and if anyone creates a well-rounded enough deck that does still body Mew. Do you have any closing thoughts, Jack?
Just obviously, we talked about a huge amount of decks today, but we may have left off your favorite or anything like that. Along with, it's the kind of video that naturally initiates conversation about where we've placed things. So leave it all down in the comments. We're really interested to see what your early testing has been. Maybe there's something we've missed. Maybe there's text we could include. Maybe there's a matchup we haven't quite considered, in your opinion. So yeah, make sure you leave it all down below. We're always really interested to hear it all. And yeah, as always, thanks for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from Omnipoke, and I look forward to seeing you guys in another video tomorrow. Cheers, everyone.